Hello and welcome to Sleeper Historian. Imagine dying in ancient Greece. Surprise! You don't get Elysium. You don't get wine with Zeus. You get to be a miserable ghost wandering around, like you've lost your car keys for eternity. The Greek afterlife wasn't glorious, it wasn't comforting. It was bleak. A shadowy underworld where most souls weren't punished, but they weren't rewarded either. They simply existed, forever, in a kind of eternal boredom. Before we descend any deeper, hit that subscribe button, because unlike the underworld, this channel actually has a reward system. Now, dim the lights. Take a deep breath, and step with me across the river Styx, where eternity is dark, dreary, and nothing like the paradise you were promised. Congratulations. You've just entered the Greek afterlife. The torches flicker as the crowd gathers at the edge of a cracked hillside, their shadows stretching thin and nervous in the half-light. Someone has died. Nothing unusual in the Greek world, but what happens next is far less ordinary. The air smells of smoke, figs left too long in the sun, and the faint salt of the nearby sea. The grieving family presses coins into the cold hands of the body, whispering prayers with the same nervous energy as someone stuffing extra quarters into a vending machine, hoping the machine doesn't eat them. The coins are meant for Charon, the ferryman of the dead. Without them, the soul will find itself stranded at the banks of the river Styx, a ghostly hitchhiker waiting for a ride that never comes. And if you've ever tried waiting for a late bus in the rain, you already have a taste of how cruel eternity could feel. The Greeks didn't imagine death as a soft, gentle rest. No angels with golden harps, no cozy reunions with grandma. Their afterlife was a place of shadows, silence, and endless walking, like the world's worst airport terminal. Without even a duty-free shop to distract you. The best most people could hope for was simply to fade into a grey echo, wandering the plains of Hades with all the other forgotten souls. The only ones granted comfort were the heroes and the chosen few, who might earn a spot in the Elysian fields, a kind of eternal VIP lounge. Everyone else, congratulations. You're stuck in the cosmic equivalent of a DMV line that never moves. At the edge of the river, the newly dead would meet Charon, a figure so terrifying in art that even his beard seemed to scowl. He rowed a boat that creaked like it had been stolen from the clearance rack of shipyards, and he had one job: ferry souls across. But Charon wasn't the type to hand out freebies. No coin, no crossing. Imagine your eternal fate resting on whether your relatives remembered to check your pockets before burial. Forget a coin, and you were doomed to linger at the riverbank for eternity, surrounded by other unlucky spirits complaining about how no one takes care of traditions anymore. If this all feels a bit bleak, it should. The Greek afterlife wasn't meant to comfort the living, it was meant to warn them. Live wrongly, and the gods will remember. Commit hubris. Too much pride. And your story won't end with quiet wandering. No, you'll find yourself condemned to Tartarus, the basement level of the underworld, where the worst sinners were given creative punishments designed by divine sadists. One man, Tantalus, was forced to stand forever in a pool of water that receded each time he bent to drink. Another, Sisyphus, rolled his boulder up the hill only for it to tumble back down, an eternal gym session with no gains. The Greeks didn't believe in boredom. They believed in poetic cruelty. And really, who hasn't had a task at work that felt like Sisyphus with better lighting? But death didn't start at the Styx. It began with the funeral rites, and Greeks took these very seriously. Women of the family would wash and anoint the body, wrapping it in fine cloth, and laying it out for mourners to visit. They wailed, they tore their hair, and they made sure the noise carried. Grief wasn't just a private matter, it was a public declaration. If you've ever seen someone cry, laughing into their phone at Starbucks, just loud enough for the whole cafe to notice, you get the vibe. Mourning was performative, raw, and meant to show both the gods and the community that proper respect was being given. Without it, the soul might not reach the underworld at all, condemned to drift endlessly in the world of the living, haunting doorways and stairwells. After the funeral procession, the journey truly began. Hermes Psychopompos, the guide of souls, would appear, a god in a winged cap, who escorted the dead like some divine Uber driver. His job was to make sure no one got lost between the world of the living and the shadows beyond. But once Hermes dropped you off, you were on your own, staring into the black waters of the Styx. The sound of it was said to echo like thunder trapped underground, and its waters could shatter even the strongest oaths. To drink from it was to erase yourself, a punishment reserved for gods and mortals alike. If you think forgetting your internet password is frustrating, imagine forgetting your entire identity forever. And then came judgment. Not the fire and brimstone spectacle of later religions, but three stern judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, deciding where your soul belonged. The majority were shuffled to the Asphodel Meadows, a grey plain where souls wandered aimlessly. Imagine the world's largest retirement community, with no bingo nights and no shuffleboard. The blessed few, heroes like Achilles, might make it to Elysium, a place of light and song. But for the unlucky sinners, Tartarus opened wide, its gates guarded by fire and monsters. It wasn't just a pit. It was a prison built for eternity. The Greeks lived with this belief as naturally as breathing. Death was never far away. War, famine, plague, all were regular guests in their world. The afterlife wasn't designed to soothe their fears. It was designed to remind them that life mattered, because death had no mercy. Every feast, every sacrifice, every whispered prayer was a hedge against the shadowy silence to come. And if you think this sounds grim, just wait until you see what happened to the souls who dared to challenge the gods themselves. The Greeks knew that to offend the gods was to risk more than just a bad harvest or a sudden thunderstorm. Death itself could be twisted into a punishment, the afterlife molded into an endless stage for cosmic humiliation. Those who dared to cheat, mock, or outwit Olympus discovered that eternity had a cruel sense of irony. The underworld was less about fire and brimstone, and more about creative torture. Punishments tailored with all the precision of a petty artist, who couldn't resist going overboard. Take Sisyphus, for example. A man clever enough to trick Thanatos, the god of death, into chains, but foolish enough to think the gods wouldn't notice. His fate was no dramatic lightning bolt or heroic duel, but a hill, a rock, an eternity. Every morning, the stone waited for him, heavy and cold. Every climb felt like hope itself. A chance that maybe, just maybe, this time he'd reach the top. But just as the boulder kissed the crest, down it went, crashing back to the bottom, leaving him with nothing but sweat and despair. If gym memberships existed in ancient Greece, this would have been the premium tier. Eternal cardio with no visible results. The Greeks didn't whisper about Sisyphus with pity. They told his story with a mix of awe and warning, a tale to remind children not to get too clever with authority. Think of it as the ancient version of, don't mess with the IRS. And then there was Tantalus, whose crime was serving the gods a feast made of his own son. Yes, you heard that right. He put the family in family dinner. For his cruelty, he was planted knee-deep in water, surrounded by fruit-laden branches. Every time he bent to drink, the water receded. Every time he reached for food, the branches pulled away. Hunger and thirst became his eternal companions, an ironic hell designed by gods who clearly enjoyed food puns. If modern life has ever tempted you with a sold out sign the second you reached the front of a line, you have lived a fraction of Tantalus' fate. Punishments like these weren't just stories. They were lessons sewn into the Greek imagination. Mortals understood that death wasn't the end of consequences. If you lived dishonorably, your memory would be cursed, your name spat upon, and your soul condemned to a creative eternity that made earthly problems seem laughable. Late rent, the Greeks might have said. At least you're not eternally dehydrated while standing in a lake. Perspective mattered. Of course, not every soul faced torment. The vast majority trudged into the Asphodel Meadows, the drab middle-class suburb of the underworld. Imagine endless grey plains, neither hot nor cold, where spirits shuffled like commuters who'd missed their stop but lacked the energy to turn back. They didn't scream, they didn't sing, they simply existed, shadows of what they once were. Memory slipped away slowly, names forgotten, desires fading. Souls wandered without purpose, bumping into each other like ghosts at an eternal cocktail party where no one bothered to refill the drinks. It sounds dull, and it was meant to. The Greeks didn't design their afterlife to comfort, they designed it to emphasize life. The shadowy monotony of Asphodel whispered a simple truth: live now, because eternity won't care about your ambitions. If you've ever scrolled mindlessly through social media, not sure what you're looking for, but unable to stop, congratulations. You've already experienced a tiny taste of asphodel. But not all hope was lost. For a select few there was Elysium, a realm bathed in sunlight and filled with music. Heroes, poets, and those blessed by the gods could find themselves here, reclining in meadows where the air itself was sweet. Think of it as the divine VIP lounge, complete with eternal wine that never ran out. While common souls trudged through asphodel, the chosen enjoyed eternal leisure, swapping war stories or composing hymns. The contrast was stark. Most of humanity shuffled in silence, while a select few lounged in eternal luxury. It was a reminder of how deeply the Greeks valued honor, courage, and divine favor. Yet even Elysium wasn't permanent. The Greeks imagined cycles, rebirths, and chances to live again. Souls could return to the world of the living, sometimes after drinking from the river Lethe, the stream of forgetfulness. To sip its waters was to erase your past entirely. Imagine standing in line for reincarnation and being told, "Oh, by the way, you won't remember anything you've learned. Good luck." It's like being forced to retake the hardest class in school without your notes. The underworld itself wasn't one uniform place. It sprawled, divided into layers and guarded by creatures that could terrify even the bravest warrior. At the gate stood Cerberus, the three-headed hound with eyes that glowed like embers. Each head snapped and snarled, ready to tear apart anyone foolish enough to sneak back to the living. And yet, despite his terrifying reputation, Cerberus was just doing his job. No one left Hades' domain. He was the underworld's ultimate security system. Imagine a guard dog crossed with airport TSA. Except this one didn't care about your liquids, only your soul. Inside, the geography was both vast and claustrophobic. Rivers cut through the land like scars. Styx. The River of Oaths was the most famous, but there were others: Acheron, the River of Sorrow, Cocytus, the River of Wailing, Phlegethon, the River of Fire, and Lethe, the River of Forgetfulness. Each river wasn't just symbolic, it was a boundary. To the Greeks, water marked transition. Between worlds, between states of being, between memory and oblivion. Souls drifted, guided or driven, their fates determined not by choice, but by the whims of gods and the judgments of ancient kings. To live in such a world was to breathe with the knowledge that death was near, and the afterlife unavoidable. Every funeral, every offering to the gods, every whispered prayer was a hedge against the silence to come. Mortals prayed for favor, but they also feared neglect. The gods were not gentle caretakers. They were distant rulers, unpredictable in their mercy. And so the Greeks honored them, not out of pure love, but out of a calculated terror. You can almost picture a farmer in some dusty village, pouring out the first sip of his wine onto the ground and muttering, "Just in case." It was the same energy as forwarding a chain email because, hey, what if it's true? The myths of the underworld served as reminders that justice lingered beyond the grave. If a murderer escaped punishment in life, the Furies would hunt them after death, driving them mad with whispers and visions, until they begged for release that never came. The Furies were relentless, winged creatures with hair of snakes, embodiments of vengeance. They weren't negotiators or therapists. They were the kind of enforcers who made sure divine law was never mocked. In this way, the afterlife was not separate from daily life, it was woven into it. Every judgment, every decision, every boast was weighed against eternity. To steal, to lie. To cheat a guest was to gamble, not only with your reputation but with your soul. Greeks understood that even if mortal courts failed, the underworld would not. And if you think this sense of cosmic justice kept people calm and orderly, you'd be half right. It also gave them a deep paranoia. A storm wasn't just a storm. It could be Zeus' anger. A sudden illness might be Apollo's arrow. And death, that was only the beginning of the gods' power over you. Life was fragile, but death was permanent. The thought was sobering, enough to make even the boldest man pause. But then again, sobering thoughts never lasted long in Greece. Wine flowed, music played, and mortals toasted to life as though to mock the darkness. And maybe that was the point. In a world where the afterlife offered no real comfort, joy had to be seized before the grave claimed it. If you think the endless grey plains of asphodel were dreary, wait until you walk deeper, where the screams of Tartarus echo like thunder trapped underground. the deeper one went into the underworld, the more the air itself seemed to change. At first it was merely still, like a forest on a windless day. But as the pathways wound downward, a heaviness settled in, a thick pressure that clung to the lungs and weighed on the chest. The Greeks imagined this descent not as a swift plunge, but as a slow unraveling, a peeling away of everything that tethered a soul to life. The sounds of the living world, birds' laughter, even the mundane hum of insects, were stripped away until only the eerie murmur of the dead remained. And that murmur was constant. Thousands of souls, restless and shifting, whispering their names, their regrets, their unfinished stories. If one strained too hard to listen, the voices tangled together until they became indistinguishable, like standing in a crowded subway station where every conversation blurred into noise. There was no escape from it, no corner of silence. For the Greeks, this was part of the punishment. The afterlife wasn't peaceful. It was saturated with the memories of countless others who would never leave. Now and then, the silence would break into sharp cries, the lamentations of Sisyphus, the river of wailing. The Greeks believed that grief itself flowed through the underworld, a current of endless sobbing that wrapped itself around the souls of the damned. To drink from it was to drown in sorrow so deep you forgot joy had ever existed. Imagine being trapped in a playlist of only the saddest songs, no skips allowed. Even Adele would have begged for a cheerful interlude. As souls shuffled through this realm, they passed judges who determined their eternal fate. Minos, the legendary king of Crete, stood tallest, draped in authority and gravitas. Rhodomanthus, his brother, was harsher, known for his rigid devotion to law. Aeacus III carried the quiet weight of fairness. Together they decided who wandered in asphodel, who rejoiced in Elysium, and who sank into Tartarus. Their rulings were not the dramatic theatrics of later religious imagery. No fiery sermons, no angels with trumpets. The judges weighed deeds and character, the balance of one's honor and shame. A shepherd who lived modestly but treated guests with respect might stand taller in judgment than a general who sought glory but lived dishonorably. The Greeks placed immense value on xenia, the sacred duty of hospitality. To turn away a guest or mistreat them was to spit on Zeus himself. And so, when judgment came, it was not always the mighty who earned paradise, but often the humble who honored the gods' invisible laws. It was a sobering reminder in a world obsessed with reputation. Your epic poem might live forever, but your soul might still wander the meadows in grey anonymity. And if you've ever gotten great performance reviews at work, only to realize your paycheck still barely covers rent, you'll understand the bitter irony. For those who fell into Tartarus, however, the imagery darkened. Tartarus was not just a prison, it was a chasm beneath the underworld itself, so deep that if a bronze anvil fell from heaven, it would take 9 days and nights before it clanged onto its floor. The walls were black iron, the air choked with fire and ash, and the cries of the damned reverberated endlessly. Here resided the Titans, chained for eternity after losing their war against the Olympians. Souls unlucky enough to be cast here found themselves among giants whose punishments were not allegories but brutal reality. Exion, for instance, was strapped to a fiery wheel, spinning endlessly through Tartarus. His crime, attempting to seduce Hera, the queen of the gods. It was not simply the act of lust that condemned him, but his ingratitude. Zeus had shown him mercy once before, and Exion repaid kindness with betrayal. And so his punishment was not quick death, but motion without purpose, a dizzying eternity of flames and failure. If you've ever gotten stuck on a broken carnival ride, multiply the terror by infinity, and you might grasp Exion's fate. Another cautionary tale came in the form of the Danaids, 50 sisters commanded to murder their husbands on their wedding night. 49 obeyed, and for this crime they were condemned to forever fill leaky jars with water. The liquid spilled endlessly, leaving their task never complete. Eternal futility was the theme of Tartarus, tasks that mocked ambition, punishments that stripped away hope. The gods did not need whips or flames to break souls. They relied on repetition, on the despair of endless cycles. And perhaps this was the Greeks' sharpest insight into human nature. True suffering isn't always in pain, but in pointlessness. The sharpest torment comes when effort meets no end, when the boulder always falls, when the jar never fills. Any office worker stuck updating spreadsheets, but no one reads has touched this truth. Yet the underworld wasn't all torment and sorrow. It was also strangely bureaucratic. Hermes might guide the soul, Charon might ferry it, judges might assign it, and then the proper guardians and rivers enforced boundaries. There was an order to it, a divine structure that mirrored the cities of the living. Just as Athens had courts, markets, and guards, so too did Hades' domain. In this way the Greeks projected their world onto death, making the afterlife familiar even as it terrified. This familiarity bred both dread and acceptance. Unlike some cultures that imagined elaborate heavens or fiery hells, the Greeks saw the afterlife as an extension of existence itself. Death did not free one from toil or sorrow, it merely shifted the stage. The poor remained forgotten, the proud were punished, and only a sliver of humanity escaped into bliss. But the underworld was not simply a place of judgment. It was also a place of story. Heroes ventured into it, mortals glimpsed it in visions, poets described it with aching detail. Orpheus, the great musician, descended with his lyre to rescue his beloved Eurydice. His music charmed even Hades and Persephone, softening their iron rule. They allowed Eurydice to return with him, on one condition. He must not look back until they had left the underworld. Of course, in the way of all tragic tales, doubt seized him at the last moment. He turned, saw her, and she vanished forever. The lesson was clear: trust the gods or lose everything. But beyond that moral, the myth revealed something profound about Greek thought. The underworld was not entirely sealed. With courage, art, or divine favor, its gates could be opened. Heroes like Heracles, Odysseus, and Aeneas all found paths to the land of the dead. Unlike later traditions where the afterlife was locked, the Greek underworld was a landscape that could be visited, traversed, and occasionally conquered. Of course, such journeys were perilous. Odysseus, during his descent, was surrounded by shades crying out for remembrance, desperate to sip the sacrificial blood he poured. They clawed and moaned, each soul begging to be heard. Only by controlling who drank could Odysseus hear their voices clearly. Otherwise, the noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of need. It was an image both horrifying and relatable, the idea that the dead longed desperately not to be forgotten. And really, who among the living doesn't secretly fear the same? In this way, Greek afterlife beliefs were not just about punishment or reward. They were about memory. To be remembered was to exist. To be forgotten was to dissolve into shadow. Poets immortalized heroes, families tended graves, and libations were poured so the dead would not fade. The greatest fear was not torture but oblivion. Think about how often today people post photos, share stories, or tag their names to be remembered. The ancient Greeks didn't have social media, but they had monuments, songs, and epic poetry. Different tools, same desire: please, don't let me vanish. It is perhaps this blend of fear and practicality that gave Greek beliefs their endurance. The underworld was not designed to comfort, but to mirror life's harsh truths. Death was inevitable, and eternity was long. So the living had two choices: honor the gods, cherish memory, and seize joy in the moment, or risk the shadowy plains, the endless punishments, and the despair of being forgotten. The people of Greece carried this knowledge into every ritual, every story, every prayer whispered before sleep. And though it might sound grim, it gave life an urgency, a sweetness sharpened by the knowledge that tomorrow was never guaranteed. If the grey monotony of asphodel seemed bleak, Tartarus was terrifying, but perhaps most chilling of all was the river Lethe, whose waters promised not torment, but forgetting. And forgetting, to the Greeks, was the most dangerous fate of all. Of all the rivers in the underworld, Lethe was the most treacherous. Its surface shimmered not with fire or blood, but with an almost inviting calm, a silvery glow that rippled like moonlight over still water. Yet those who drank from it lost their memories, surrendering their names, their loves, their entire pasts. For ordinary souls in asphodel, forgetting could bring peace, a way to drift through eternity without the constant ache of nostalgia. But to heroes, poets, and philosophers, it was a fate worse than torment. What use was glory if you could not remember achieving it? The Greeks told of some souls who willingly bent down to sip, eager to dissolve their burdens. But others resisted, clutching their memories like precious relics, even when it meant suffering. And perhaps this is why Lethe became not just a river, but a metaphor. To forget was to die twice, once in body and once in spirit. In later philosophical schools, the river took on new meaning. Plato described souls who drank only a little, so that when they reincarnated, faint whispers of memory guided their new lives. Genius, he hinted, might simply be the soul remembering what it once knew. It was a fascinating paradox. The Greeks dreaded both remembering too much and forgetting too completely. Memory was pain, but memory was also immortality. The dead whispered constantly, begging to be recalled by the living, terrified that without offerings and songs, they would slip into the waters and vanish. It is no wonder that tombstones bore not only names but instructions, pleas, and warnings, remember me. In a way, every gravestone was an anti-lether charm. And then, there was Mnemosine, the tightness of memory, whose very presence countered Lether's oblivion. Orphic mystery cults whispered that the wise should seek Mnemosyne's spring instead of Lether's, to drink not forgetfulness but remembrance, to be remembered eternally. Now that was divine. Some burial tablets from the ancient world even carried instructions for the soul. When you reach the house of Hades, do not drink from Lether. Drink instead from the pool of memory, so that you may live again among the blessed. Death, then, became a test of discernment. Choose the wrong cup, and your essence dissolved. Choose wisely, and eternity held something brighter. Still, most souls weren't philosophers or initiates. They shuffled endlessly, nameless and weary, caught between silence and sobbing rivers. Even heroes, if they failed to earn divine exception, found themselves fading into the background. Achilles himself, when Odysseus met him in the underworld, confessed that he would rather be a poor farmer, alive than king of all the dead. His words were a sobering reminder that glory was only comforting to the living who sang of it. The dead were left with the grey truth. The Greeks, practical as always, took these lessons seriously. If even Achilles despised death, what hope had ordinary mortals? Their rituals reflected this urgency. Libations poured onto the ground, honey cakes for Hades, wreaths and offerings for the departed. These weren't just pious gestures, they were insurance policies. The dead needed to be remembered, needed to be fed with attention, or else they might return restless, wandering back into the world of the living as shades. Better to appease them with wine than risk a midnight haunting. The afterlife was grim, yes, but it was also porous. Stories abounded of ghosts who lingered, of omens seen in the smoke of sacrifice, of ancestors whispering through dreams. The boundary between worlds was thin, and for the Greeks, to ignore the dead was not only disrespectful but dangerous. Fear was the glue that held ritual together. Yet even in their darkest tales, the Greeks laced their mythology with a kind of humor. Consider Sisyphus, condemned to push his boulder forever uphill. On paper, it is a bleak punishment, eternal futility. But there is also something comically absurd about the image, a man eternally grunting, sweating, cursing, only to have the stone roll back down each time. It's slapstick turned cosmic. The gods may have meant it as torment, but one imagines some shade watching from asphodel, chuckling at the sight. This balance of horror and irony was quintessentially Greek. They understood the ridiculousness of existence as much as its tragedy. Death was terrifying, yes, but it was also full of strange comedy. How else can one face eternity except with a smirk? Of course, humor had its limits. The torments of the truly wicked were recited with grim fascination. Tantalus, forever thirsty with water receding from his lips, forever hungry with fruit pulling away from his grasp, was no laughing matter. He had dared to serve his own son as a feast to the gods, and the punishment fit the crime: eternal hunger, eternal mockery. The lesson was clear. Do not test the gods with arrogance, or you will find eternity serving as the punchline to your own grisly joke. And then came the most haunting thought of all: what if eternity was not punishment or reward, but indifference? The vast majority of souls did not spin on wheels of fire, or clutch leaking jars, or shove boulders. They simply drifted. Their existence was so unremarkable, it hardly bore mentioning. To live a life that ended in grey anonymity, this was the fate that most Greeks accepted for themselves. It is this acceptance that makes Greek beliefs so striking. Unlike religions that promised salvation for all who believed, the Greeks were unapologetically blunt. The afterlife would not be fair, nor would it be pleasant. At best, one might cling to memory; at worst, one might fade into shadow. The system did not comfort, it warned. And in doing so, It pushed the living to seize their days with ferocity. Carpe diem wasn't a Roman invention, it was a necessity born of Greek despair. Imagine the pressure. Every feast, every song, every fleeting romance mattered, because eternity would not grant second chances. To waste a day was to hand it willingly to Lethe. And so the Greeks danced harder, drank deeper, loved fiercely, and built monuments to themselves and their gods. They weren't naive enough to think death would reward them, so they sought their glory while breath still filled their lungs. In the end, the Greek afterlife was less a map of geography and more a mirror of philosophy. It reflected their realism, their dark humor, their obsession with memory, and their uneasy reverence for the gods. It told them that life was fragile, memory was fleeting, and eternity was long. And so they carved their names into stone. They told stories that would echo across millennia. They wrote tragedies so raw that audiences thousands of years later still feel their sting. Hades' kingdom may have swallowed them all, but in remembering them, we keep them from Lethe even now. Achilles still sulks in shadow, Sisyphus still grunts at his rock, Orpheus still strums his sorrowful lyre. The underworld holds their shades, but memory holds their essence. And perhaps that was the Greeks' greatest triumph, though their vision of the afterlife was bleak. Their legacy ensured they would not vanish into grey anonymity. They defied Lethe by writing themselves into eternity. Thus ends the first chapter of their shadowed truths. Beyond this, there are more tales to uncover, of gods who loved too fiercely, of mortals who dared too greatly, of heroes who straddled the line between glory and hubris. For the Greek world did not stop at the underworld, it sprawled across sea and sky, mountain and myth. And so, as the shades of asphodel fade behind us, the story turns toward brighter, but no less perilous realms. For next comes the tales of Olympus, of thunder and rivalry, of feasts that sparked wars and jealousies that shaped destiny. The gods themselves now step onto the stage. High above the smoking hearths and dusty roads of mortal Greece, where goats clattered over stony hillsides and fishermen cursed the wind that flipped their nets, another world hovered, bright, golden, and untouchably smug. Mount Olympus rose from the earth like a pillar between realms, its summit hidden behind clouds so thick mortals could only guess at the splendor inside. From below it looked empty, just a jagged peak catching storms. But within its veiled crest lay the palace of the gods. The place was not carved from mortal stone, but breathed into being, gleaming walls that never cracked, colonnades that seemed taller than forests, and floors of marble so polished you might think Zeus himself had invented floor wax. The air shimmered there, always spring, never too hot, never too cold. Wine poured itself, music hummed without instruments, and feasts never spoiled. It was paradise with just enough arrogance baked in to remind everyone that this was not for humans. The gods reclined in eternal luxury, sipping nectar, the divine equivalent of an overpriced cocktail, and nibbling ambrosia, which mortals imagined as a food so wondrous it made you immortal. In truth, it was probably less a fruit or bread and more a cosmic energy bar, packed with whatever proteins powered divinity. The gods had endless feasts, endless gossip, endless rivalries, and the most dramatic family squabbles the world had ever seen. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner stretched into eternity, but every guest has lightning bolts, shape-shifting powers, and grudges older than empires. Zeus, king of this heavenly household, sat enthroned at the center, a figure so imposing that even his beard looked like it could declare war. His voice was thunder, his eyes storm clouds, his temper unpredictable. Yet he was also laughably human in his vices. His endless affairs with mortals, nymphs, and the occasional disguised cow were legendary. Every dalliance left behind demigod offspring, who would later crowd Greek myths like guest stars in a soap opera. If reality TV existed on Olympus, Zeus would have been the scandalous headline every week, supreme ruler spotted again in disguise, this time as a swan. Hera not amused. Hera, his queen, embodied majesty and fury. She presided with elegance, her robes flowing like captured rainbows, her eyes sharp as the talons of the peacock that bore her symbol. But beneath the finery simmered an eternal rage, not only at Zeus's wandering eye, but at the mortal women, who often unwillingly, became entangled in his schemes. Hera's vengeance was legendary. She rarely struck Zeus himself. Divine politics made that complicated, but she unleashed her fury on his lovers and children, with ruthless creativity. The moral of half of Greek myth might as well have been, don't accidentally catch Zeus' attention, or Hera will personally make sure your life becomes a tragic opera. If mortals prayed for protection from Hera, they often added a nervous little extra offering, just in case. It was like trying to tip both the waiter and the chef, hoping the kitchen wouldn't spit in your food. The court of Olympus did not rest only on the tempestuous marriage at its core. Around Zeus and Hera orbited their divine siblings and children, each with their own spheres, powers, and spectacular dysfunctions. Poseidon, god of the sea, strode the halls with salt still clinging to his skin. His trident ever ready, he was moody as the waves, calm one moment and crashing with fury the next. To sailors, Poseidon was either your best friend or the last face you'd ever see. His brothers joked, cautiously, that he spent so much time soaking underwater, he might as well have been married to his own reflection. Then there was Hades, the third brother, who almost never visited Olympus. Though equal in stature, he ruled the underworld and preferred its shadows. To the Olympians, he was more guest than resident, the distant relative who skipped family dinners but sent polite notes. Mortals, however, feared him more than any god. Hades did not punish unnecessarily, nor did he reward. He simply enforced the inevitable. His presence in Olympus was rare, but always unsettling. Like when the quiet uncle suddenly appears at the wedding reception, and everyone remembers he owns half the estate. The younger Olympians added fire and chaos to the mix. Athena, born fully armored from Zeus' head after a particularly bad headache, embodied wisdom and war strategy. She was calm, calculating, and as close to rational as a deity could be. Her temples gleamed across Greece, and mortals trusted her above most. If Olympus had board meetings, Athena would chair them, calmly outlining the consequences while everyone else argued. Her half-brother Ares, on the other hand, represented the bloodlust of war without the strategy. Where Athena saw tactics, Ares saw chaos. He thundered into battles, reveling in the screams and clash of blades, glorying in destruction for its own sake. Even the other gods found him exhausting, the coworker who mistakes every brainstorming session for a cage fight. Mortals both worshipped and feared him, though most hoped never to catch his attention. Aphrodite glided among them, laughter as soft as silk, beauty so potent it could unseat kingdoms. Born from the sea foam, or more scandalously, from the castrated remains of Uranus thrown into the ocean, she was both allure and terror. Mortals blamed her for every reckless affair and love struck war, but none dared curse her aloud. In her presence, even gods stumbled, tripping over words and reason. If Zeus was the storm, Aphrodite was the undertow, gentle until it dragged you under. And then came Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, limping but unbowed. Thrown from Olympus by Hera at birth for his deformity, he returned with skill unmatched, forging the very weapons of the gods. His hammers rang like thunder, shaping bronze and gold into armor that gleamed with celestial fire. Despite his genius, he was married, ironically, to Aphrodite, whose affections wandered elsewhere, often to Ares. Hephaestus bore it with bitterness and craft, sometimes setting traps to catch the lovers in flagrante. Gossip traveled faster than Hermes when that happened. Speaking of Hermes, he was the divine trickster, messenger, and smuggler of boundaries. With winged sandals and a mischievous grin, Hermes moved between worlds, carrying decrees, stealing cattle, and whispering clever lies. Mortals adored him, partly because he was approachable, partly because he looked like he'd sell you a slightly used chariot, and you'd still thank him afterward. He invented dice music and commerce, ensuring that both gamblers and merchants prayed to him with equal fervor. And then there was Dionysus, the latecomer, god of wine, ecstasy, and theater. His arrival to Olympus was controversial, a younger generation muscling into the family hierarchy. He represented liberation, chaos, and the thin line between joy and madness. His worshippers roared with laughter, wept with abandon, and tore raw flesh in ecstatic frenzy. To some gods he was a nuisance, to others a revelation. To mortals he was both a blessing and a very bad hangover. Life in Olympus was not the serene order mortals might imagine. Feasts erupted into quarrels, jealousies flared, and petty competitions spiraled into wars that reshaped the mortal world. The Trojan War itself began at a divine party, when Eris, goddess of discord, tossed a golden apple inscribed, "To the fairest," into the feast. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite fought over it, dragging Paris of Troy into the dispute, and the rest, burning cities, endless bloodshed, wooden horses, was history. All because goddesses couldn't resist an apple. Mortals might starve for want of bread, but Olympus waged wars over fruit. And yet, for all their flaws, the gods embodied human life at its most exaggerated. They were mirrors held up to mortals, every vice, every ambition, every insecurity blown to immortal scale. To pray to them was to admit that humanity itself was woven from divine chaos. Mortals offered sacrifices, hoping to catch favor, fearing wrath, and secretly whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, the gods were no wiser than they were. From the golden halls of Olympus, storms brewed that shaped the world below. Every flirtation, every rivalry, every careless word spoken over nectar might ripple outward, toppling kings and raising heroes. The mortals looked upward, saw only clouds, and wondered if the thunder rumbling through the sky was mere weather, or the sound of Zeus clearing his throat. If the underworld taught the Greeks how to fear death, Olympus taught them how to fear life itself, with all its volatility, ambition, and endless drama. For the gods were not distant deities, they were family writ large, with all the bickering and backstabbing of a household, too cramped to contain its egos. And if you think divine dinner parties sound exhausting, wait until you see what happens when the gods decide to meddle directly in mortal affairs. From their lofty halls, the gods rarely resisted the temptation to interfere below. It was as if mortals existed not as independent beings, but as pawns on a cosmic chessboard where the pieces were constantly arguing with the players. A farmer might till his fields, blissfully unaware that Poseidon was about to ruin his harvest, because someone had forgotten to offer a fish. A young woman might light a lamp at Aphrodite's shrine, never knowing that her small act of devotion would spark divine jealousy and twist her fate beyond recognition. Mortals didn't just fear the gods. They braced for them, the way one braces for an unpredictable relative who shows up uninvited with both gifts and insults. To live in Greece was to live under divine surveillance, where every triumph or disaster carried a hint of Olympus. Cattle went missing. Hermes was probably teaching someone a lesson. A sudden storm capsized your ship. Poseidon had woken up cranky. Your wedding went awry. Hera had noticed your groom's wandering eye. But the gods weren't merely cruel, they were intensely emotional. They loved deeply, raged furiously, and sulked theatrically. Their passions shaped myths that mortals retold not just as entertainment, but as warnings. When Zeus descended in disguise to court a mortal woman, villagers whispered of the child that might come. A hero or a tragedy, sometimes both. When Artemis, chaste and vengeful, discovered Actaeon spying on her bath, she transformed him into a stag and let his own hounds tear him apart. Mortals retold such tales by firelight with a nervous laugh, the way one might joke about taxes or illness. Too real to dismiss, too terrifying to ignore. The gods' involvement in war was perhaps the most notorious meddling. Mortals fought with swords and shields, but above them hovered Athena and Ares, Aphrodite and Apollo, each backing their favorites like gamblers at a racetrack. The Trojan War was the grandest spectacle of this divine interference. 10 years of bloodshed, driven as much by Olympus as by mortal stubbornness. Hera and Athena, snubbed by Paris' judgment, lent their cunning and wrath to the Greeks. Aphrodite, ever protective of her chosen, shielded Paris and favored Troy. Even Zeus, who pretended neutrality, couldn't resist stirring the pot, nudging events with a thunderbolt here, a dream there. Mortals may have carried the spears, but the gods rolled the dice. And the gods never forgot to make things personal. Achilles, Greece's fiercest warrior, was destined for glory but short life, a bargain struck between his mortal mother and fate itself. His invincibility, marred only by his famous heel, made him both terrifying and fragile. Apollo, angered by Greek insults to his priest, unleashed plagues on their armies. Hera schemed constantly, planting ideas like seeds of discord. By the time the wooden horse rolled into Troy, it wasn't just mortal cunning at work, but the gods laughing behind their hands, eager to see what chaos would follow. Mortals, for their part, tried to appeal to divine favor with rituals, temples, and endless sacrifice. Smoke rose from 1,000 altars, carrying the scent of roasted lamb and olive oil heavenward. Cities competed for patronage, claiming Athena or Apollo as their protector, draping their temples in marble and gold. To win a god's favor was to win prestige, power, and perhaps survival. To offend them was to invite disaster. Whole cities could burn for a single slight, as Troy discovered all too well. Yet, beneath their destructive whims, the gods also embodied inspiration. Poets called upon the muses before reciting verse, musicians strummed lyres to Apollo, and playwrights invoked Dionysus to bless their theatre. Art, music, and literature became offerings themselves, born from the belief that creativity flowed directly from Olympus. To create was to brush against divinity, to steal a spark of immortality for a moment. Perhaps that was the gods' slyest trick of all. They dangled inspiration as bait, making mortals love them even as they feared them. Olympus itself was a paradox of grandeur and dysfunction. The banquets glittered with silver goblets and unending song, but under the laughter seethed jealousy. Hera scowled at Zeus' wandering gaze. Athena rolled her eyes at Ares' boasts. Hephaestus hammered with bitterness, while Aphrodite slipped into another lover's arms. Dionysus filled cups until the line between joy and madness blurred. Hermes whispered jokes, trading secrets like coins, while Poseidon sulked about never being top of the hierarchy, despite controlling 2/3 of the world. Even Zeus, for all his thunderous authority, often found himself struggling to keep order. At one infamous banquet, the gods plotted to overthrow him entirely. Hera, Athena and Poseidon conspired, binding him with chains. It might have worked had Thetis not summoned Briareus, a 100-handed giant, to intervene. The rebellion crumbled, but the scars of mistrust lingered. If the gods could not trust their king, could mortals trust their gods? Still, Olympus endured, perhaps because dysfunction itself was its engine. Conflict gave the gods meaning, and drama kept them sharp. A perfect paradise might have grown dull, but Olympus thrived on chaos. Each feud birthed myths, each quarrel sparked lessons, each affair altered destinies. To mortals, these tales became not just stories but moral compasses, cautionary fables, and shared entertainment. The gods may have been terrifying landlords, but they were also the ultimate celebrities, scandalous, larger than life, impossible to ignore. And mortals loved to gossip about them. Around hearths, shepherds repeated the story of Zeus appearing as a bull, carrying Europa across the sea. In markets, traders retold the tale of Hermes, stealing Apollo's cattle and charming him with a lyre. In theatres, entire cities gathered to weep at tragedies blessed by Dionysus. Olympus bled into every corner of Greek life, shaping not just belief but culture, art, and imagination. The irony was sharp: the gods, immortal and powerful, depended on mortals to remember them. Without prayers, sacrifices, and stories, their grandeur might fade. Memory was as essential to Olympus as it was to the shades of Hades. The gods were eternal, yes, but their influence lived only as long as mortals kept singing their names. As thunder rolled over Greece, mortals looked up and wondered whether their offerings had been enough. Perhaps the storm was just weather. Or perhaps Zeus was clearing his throat, ready to tip the balance of their fragile lives once again. The underworld had revealed the Greeks' fear of death. Olympus revealed their awe and suspicion of power. Both realms loomed over human existence, teaching that life was never safe from forces beyond one's control. And yet, within that fear, the Greeks found meaning, inspiration, and stories that outlived the very temples where sacrifices once burned. Olympus was less a home of gods than a mirror of human folly, magnified until it shook the skies. To glimpse it was to glimpse ourselves, ambitious, flawed, passionate, and endlessly hungry for significance. And if you thought the gods' eternal drama was overwhelming, just wait until we descend into the world of mortals, who tried to court their favor directly. Mystery cults, secret rituals, and forbidden rites where ordinary Greeks whispered promises to win a taste of divine power. To walk through the streets of ancient Greece was to pass temples and shrines at every turn. Grand columns rising toward the heavens, small altars tucked into corners, statues polished smooth by generations of hands. Religion was not something tucked away for Sundays. It was woven into daily bread, wine, and gossip. Yet beneath the public sacrifices and glittering festivals lurked something quieter, stranger, and infinitely more alluring: the mystery cults. The word mystery, in this sense, had nothing to do with detective novels or unsolved crimes. It came from the Greek mysterion, meaning secret rite or hidden knowledge. And in a world where most rituals were performed out in the open, Oxen sacrificed in full view, priests chanting loudly enough for the entire agora to hear. The promise of secrecy was intoxicating. Mystery cults whispered, "Come closer, step inside, and you will learn something no ordinary mortal can know." Public religion was about community and spectacle. Mystery cults were about intimacy and transformation. They promised not just the gods' favor, but a personal experience, a brush with the eternal. That was no small selling point in a world where death was an ever-present neighbor, and the afterlife, as we've seen, looked suspiciously like a never-ending waiting room. The most famous of these was the Eleusinian Mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. For centuries, pilgrims flocked to Eleusis, a small town near Athens, walking the sacred way in solemn procession. What exactly happened inside the Great Hall of Initiation? No one outside the cult could say. The penalties for revealing its secrets were severe: ostracism at best, execution at worst, and remarkably in a city as gossipy as Athens. The core of the Eleusinian rituals stayed secret for nearly 2,000 years. That alone might be the greatest miracle. We know enough, though, to glimpse their power. Initiates fasted, purified themselves, and drank a special potion called kykeon. They descended into darkness, confronted symbolic death, and then emerged into blazing light. At the climax, sacred objects were revealed, perhaps a sheaf of grain, perhaps something stranger, now lost to time. Whatever it was, participants swore they felt changed forever. Many claimed they no longer feared death, certain that Demeter's promise of rebirth was theirs as well. It is easy for modern minds to scoff. All that fuss for a cup of barley water and a light show. But the ancients weren't joking. Cicero, no sentimental fool, called the Eleusinian Mysteries the greatest gift Athens ever gave the world. To be initiated was to walk through life with secret armor, a private assurance that death was not the end, and Eleusis was only the beginning. Across Greece and later Rome, mystery cults sprouted like vines. The cult of Dionysus lured devotees with ecstatic dances, wine-drenched rituals, and the promise of losing oneself in divine madness. Outsiders saw chaos, but insiders spoke of liberation, of tasting a world beyond reason where God and mortal blurred. The cult of Orpheus, meanwhile, sang of cosmic truths hidden in music and verse. Orphic initiates carried tablets inscribed with instructions for the afterlife, cheat sheets for Hades that told the soul which springs to drink from and which to avoid. It was the ultimate travel guide for death. Even foreign gods found eager worshippers. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia, all offered initiation, secrecy, and salvation. For many, these cults filled the gap between official religion's stiff formality and the messy uncertainty of daily life. A sacrifice in the agora might win Athena's blessing for the city. But what about you personally? The mysteries said, "Come closer, and you will not be forgotten." Naturally, the authorities grew uneasy. Secret gatherings, initiation oaths, and ecstatic trances smacked of conspiracy. Were these cults just religious clubs, or potential revolutions? Rome especially didn't like unanswered questions. The Senate famously cracked down on the Bacchanalia in 186 BCE, fearing that too much wine and secrecy might lead not just to spiritual awakening but political rebellion. Yet despite suspicion, the cults thrived. Why? Because they spoke directly to human longing. The craving for meaning, for reassurance in the face of death, for intimacy with forces greater than ourselves. Public sacrifices could impress the crowd, but mysteries touched the soul. And let's be honest, the element of exclusivity didn't hurt. To be initiated was to join a spiritual elite, to walk among your neighbors with the quiet confidence that you knew something they didn't. The mysteries gave ordinary shepherds and merchants a taste of hidden power, a feeling of being chosen. Humans have always loved a velvet rope, even if it leads to a barley potion and a darkened hall. Still, secrecy comes with a price. For every awe-struck initiate, there was a skeptical outsider muttering about fraud. Were the priests of Eleusis genuine mediators of divine truth, or clever stage managers with a knack for special effects? Did the ecstatic frenzy of Dionysus reveal cosmic oneness, or was it just an excuse to get drunk and howl at the moon? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Religion, after all, thrives on spectacle, and mystery cults were masters of it. Darkness, chanting, ritual objects, moments of sudden revelation, all the ingredients of a psychological roller coaster. But that doesn't mean it was all empty show. Human minds are wired to find meaning in ritual, to feel awe in the face of mystery, and the mysteries provided that in spades. To stand in darkness, fasted and trembling, then suddenly see light flood a hall, accompanied by sacred words, how could that not feel like touching eternity? Modern people pay good money for concerts, light installations, and immersive theatre to chase a fraction of that sensation. For the ancients, the mysteries were the ultimate performance, one that promised not just entertainment but salvation. And so the cults endured, their secrets carried like embers through centuries. Even as empires rose and fell, even as gods were renamed and reshaped, the mysteries whispered on, there is more than what you see. There is a truth hidden behind the veil. Come closer, and you may know it too. The allure of secrecy, the thrill of initiation, the hope of immortality, these made the mystery cults irresistible. But what exactly did it feel like to join? How did an ordinary Athenian or Roman, weary from daily life, experience that passage from outsider to initiate? For that, we must follow the pilgrim's path more closely, step by step, into the sacred heart of Eleusis itself. The road to Eleusis began in Athens, not far from the bustle of the agora. Imagine the scene: thousands of pilgrims gathered, clutching bundles, chanting prayers, and trying to keep their sandals from slipping off in the dust. The sacred way stretched before them like a ribbon of promise, winding out of the city and into the countryside. To walk it was to leave ordinary life behind, if only for a while. At first, the mood was almost festive. Children chattered, merchants sold figs and honeycakes along the road, musicians played flutes. Think of it like a music festival with fewer tents and more oxen. Yet underneath the cheer lurked a seriousness. Every step brought the pilgrim closer to mystery, to the threshold of death and rebirth. Jokes died down as the procession neared Eleusis. Voices hushed, sandals slowed. By the time the great hall of initiation came into view, anticipation hung in the air like incense. Inside, initiates fasted. Stomachs growled, minds sharpened, nerves frayed. Fasting was not just about purity, but about stripping the body bare, making the soul hungry for revelation. Hunger does funny things to people. It makes shadows loom larger, whispers sound louder, and promises of salvation taste sweeter. The priests knew this, of course. They were not just ritual leaders, but stage managers of the psyche. Then came the kykeon, a barley and mint drink that looked unassuming, but carried great symbolic weight. Some modern scholars speculate it may have contained ergot, a fungus with psychedelic properties. If so, that would certainly explain why initiates described visions of gods and radiant fields. But even if it was just barley water, the timing, after days of fasting, ensured it would hit like divine nectar. Ordinary ingredients can taste extraordinary when your belly is empty and your mind primed for wonder. Darkness followed. Initiates were led into the telesterion, the great hall, its walls thick with centuries of whispered secrets. Torches flickered, smoke curled. The crowd pressed close, breath mingling, hearts pounding. Suddenly the air shifted. A voice rose, chanting words that carried the weight of ages. This was no marketplace speech. This was the sound of eternity knocking at the door. Objects were revealed. To modern ears, descriptions sound almost anticlimactic. Grain tools, perhaps a cloak. Yet in that charged atmosphere, under the weight of ritual, these ordinary things became cosmic symbols. Grain was no longer just food, but the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, Demeter's grief, and Persephone's return. A torch was no longer fire but divine light piercing the underworld's gloom. The hall itself trembled with the power of shared imagination. Then, the climax: sudden, blinding light. After hours in darkness, after fasting, chanting, and waiting, the eruption of fire and brightness was overwhelming. Initiates gasped, some wept. Others fell silent. The boundary between mortal and divine seemed to dissolve. In that moment, every pilgrim felt touched by the eternal, cradled by Demeter. Promised that death was not final. It was theatre, yes, but theatre so profound that it etched itself into the soul. And when it ended, the relief was palpable. Laughter bubbled up, relief loosened tongues. Pilgrims emerged with a kind of glow, not from actual divinity, perhaps, but from the shared conviction that they had glimpsed something greater. They walked back to Athens lighter, steadier, certain that life's worst fear had lost its sting. Of course, not everyone believed. Cynics scoffed that it was all smoke and mirrors. A clever trick to keep people loyal and pious. But those who had been through it insisted it was real. And perhaps that was the point. Mystery rites didn't need to prove themselves to skeptics. They were about experience, not argument. You could no more explain initiation to an outsider than describe the taste of wine to someone who had never sipped it. Over time, these initiations rippled outward. Philosophers borrowed their language, poets hinted at their secrets, and even statesmen boasted of their initiation. Cicero claimed that through the mysteries he learned not just how to live, but how to die. That is no small endorsement from a man who survived Roman politics for decades. Other cults mimicked the pattern. The Orphics promised initiates that their souls would bypass the mud of Hades and soar toward the stars. The Dionysian revels promised not just a glimpse of rebirth, but a full-on possession, God riding mortal like a chariot. In every case, the core idea was the same. Through secrecy and ritual, death could be softened, maybe even conquered. This was a radical departure from Homer's bleak vision of the afterlife as a dreary half-existence. The mysteries insisted there was hope, that the soul was not doomed to wander forever in shadow. For people who lived with plagues, war, and famine as constant companions, that was irresistible. No wonder initiation was treasured, guarded, whispered about for centuries. Even as Christianity rose, echoes of the mysteries lingered. Baptism, communion, the language of rebirth, all bear uncanny resemblance to older rites. It seems that once humans tasted the sweetness of secret ritual promising life beyond death, they could never quite let it go. And yet, secrecy remains. To this day, we do not fully know what happened in the Telesterion. Scholars argue, theories multiply, books pile high. But the truth is that the heart of the mystery remains intact, just as intended. What mattered was not the props, or the potion, but the transformation itself. The mysteries worked because they convinced, and in convincing, they became real. So imagine yourself there, hungry, trembling, waiting in darkness. The torch flares, the hall floods with light, and for a heartbeat, eternity seems to open its hand to you. That sensation, fleeting yet unforgettable, was worth every step on the sacred way. And if you think the mysteries were strange, wait until you see what happened when mortals dared to defy fate itself. Trying not just to glimpse the underworld, but to cheat it entirely. Because the Greeks had stories, dark, desperate stories, of those who thought they could outwit death. The Greeks respected the gods, but they secretly adored the rule-breakers. After all, who doesn't admire the gambler who thinks they can outwit fate, even if the dice are loaded? The underworld may have been inescapable, but a few daring souls tried anyway. Their stories are etched into myth like graffiti on a temple wall, half warning, half guilty admiration. Take Sisyphus, king of Corinth, smooth-talking, sharper than a knife at a feast. He was the kind of man who would smile, shake your hand, and sell you your own sandals while you weren't looking. Cleverness was his gift, but also his curse, because he used it on the wrong opponent, death itself. One day, Thanatos, the god of death, came knocking. But Sisyphus wasn't about to go quietly. He welcomed Thanatos into his palace, offered him wine, and, like the best of hosts, chained him to a chair, literally. For a while, no one on earth could die. Soldiers stabbed each other on battlefields and just kept groaning. Old men lingered in painful limbo, begging for release. The gods were not amused. Eventually Ares, tired of being a war god with no actual casualties, freed Thanatos and dragged Sisyphus kicking into Hades. But even then, Sisyphus wasn't finished. Before dying, he told his wife not to bury his body, not even to toss a coin for the ferryman. When he arrived in the underworld, he put on his best pitiful face and told Persephone that it was all a mistake. Poor man! No proper funeral! No rites! Surely he should be allowed back just long enough to scold his wife. Amazingly, Persephone agreed. Maybe she liked rebels, maybe she just wanted him gone. Sisyphus returned to the world of the living, and promptly went back to his old tricks. He never intended to return at all. That was mistake number 3. Hermes finally dragged him back in chains, and this time, the gods made sure there would be no loopholes. His punishment: an eternal boulder. Push it up a hill, watch it roll down, repeat forever. Now, if you've ever worked customer service, you already understand Sisyphus perfectly. The endless climb, the crushing weight, the smug inevitability of failure, it's the spiritual cousin of, per my last email. But Sisyphus wasn't alone. Orpheus, the poet so gifted his songs could charm trees, rivers, even the stones underfoot, also thought he could game the underworld. His beloved Eurydice died from a snakebite, and Orpheus, inconsolable, took his lyre and descended into Hades itself. Few mortals dared such a thing, but Orpheus didn't just survive. He thrived. His music softened the hearts of judges, calmed the hounds of Hades, and even made Persephone weep. Moved by his devotion, Hades did something almost unthinkable. He agreed to release Eurydice. There was one condition. Orpheus must not look back until they had reached the surface. Simple. And yet, when you know everything depends on one rule, it gnaws at you like a mosquito in the dark. Step by step they climbed, silence pressing in, Orpheus, heart pounding. He could almost hear Eurydice behind him. But was she really there? Or was it a cruel trick? Inches from the sunlight, doubt won. He turned. And in an instant, she was gone, pulled back into shadow forever. The gods keep their bargains, but they never forgive hesitation. The story spread like wildfire through Greece, both a tragedy and a lesson. Trust matters, patience matters, and when the stakes are cosmic, self-doubt can destroy everything. Orpheus's song still lingers in myths, but his ending reminds us that love is no shield against the iron law of death. Not all attempts at cheating death were doomed to folly. Some, strangely enough, succeeded, though rarely in the way mortals intended. Alcestis, wife of Admetus, is a prime example. When her husband learned he was fated to die young, he cut a deal with the fates. Someone could die in his place. Charming, right? Admetus asked his friends. They refused. He asked his parents. They laughed him off. Only Alcestis agreed, stepping forward with heartbreaking devotion. When death came for Admetus, Alcestis went willingly in his stead. The house plunged into mourning. But fate, it seems, had a soft spot for her sacrifice. Enter Heracles, fresh from his labors, who happened to stop by and found Admetus drowning in grief. Heracles wrestled Thanatos himself, because of course he did, and won Alcestis back. She returned to the world of the living, pale but breathing, the rare soul who crossed the boundary and returned. It was the kind of story that made Greeks argue over dinner tables. Was Admetus a coward, or just human? Was Alcestis a saint, or a victim of love's cruelty? And most importantly, should Heracles really be allowed to just suplex death whenever he felt like it? What ties these stories together is not just their drama, but their warning. Cheating death was tempting, but it always came at a price. Sisyphus got eternal labor. Orpheus got heartbreak. Alcestis returned, but only through divine wrestling matches. The underworld had rules, and breaking them was like tugging the beard of Zeus. Satisfying for a second, catastrophic the next. Yet the Greeks kept telling these tales, not as simple tragedies but as explorations of hope and defiance. To them, trying to cheat death wasn't foolish. It was deeply human. Everyone wanted one more day, one more embrace, one more chance. Myths gave those desires shape, then showed their consequences with poetic flair. And if you think Sisyphus' punishment was bad, wait until you meet the other prisoners of Hades, the ones whose crimes were darker, their punishments more gruesome, and their eternity a masterclass in divine overreaction. If Sisyphus was the poster child of endless futility, then Tantalus was the poster child of eternal frustration. His story reads like a tragic comedy sketch, written by someone with a grudge against dinner parties. Tantalus had once dined with the gods themselves, reclining at Olympus' golden table. Imagine it: ambrosia, nectar, witty banter with Zeus, the whole VIP treatment. But Tantalus was that guest who just couldn't behave. First, he stole divine food and tried to sneak it back to mortals, like stuffing hors d'oeuvres into his toga for later. Then, in a darker twist, he invited the gods to a banquet at his palace, and served them his own son, Pelops, chopped up and cooked. It was the ancient equivalent of trying to prank Gordon Ramsay by serving him a rubber chicken, except this was infinitely worse. The gods, naturally, were horrified. They reassembled Pelops, thankfully one of the easier resurrections in myth, though he ended up with an ivory shoulder as a spare part, and condemned Tantalus to the underworld. There he was placed in a pool of clear water beneath a tree heavy with fruit. Perfect, right? Except every time he bent to drink, the water drained away. Every time he reached for fruit, the branches jerked out of reach. Thirsty, starving, surrounded by plenty, forever denied. The word tantalize still carries his legacy. If you've ever stared at a vending machine that ate your money without delivering the snack, you know a fraction of his torment. Then there was Ixion, whose crime was less culinary and more scandalous. Once a mortal king, he managed to offend just about everyone. He killed his father-in-law, failed to pay reparations, and when Zeus kindly invited him to Olympus to wipe the slate clean, Ixion repaid him by lusting after Hera. Zeus, ever suspicious, set a trap. He fashioned a cloud in Hera's shape, because apparently gods had spare time, and Ixion, not the brightest torch in the temple, fell for it. From that union came the race of centaurs, which frankly explains a lot about their behavior. As punishment, Ixion was strapped to a fiery, spinning wheel in the depths of Hades, turning endlessly like the world's worst carnival ride. He spins still, a cosmic warning against arrogance and inappropriate crushes on other people's spouses, especially when that spouse is queen of the heavens. Next on the roll call, the Danaids, 50 sisters all ordered to marry their 50 cousins. Already a nightmare scenario. On their wedding night, 49 of them killed their husbands in bed, only one sister, Hypermnestra, spared hers. Their punishment: eternity spent carrying water in leaky jars, forever filling, forever emptying. Imagine spending eternity trying to load groceries into plastic bags that rip every time. That's the Danaids' fate. Labor without progress, effort without reward. And then there was Tityus, a giant who thought it would be clever to assault Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis. Bad idea. In Hades, he was stretched across 9 acres. 9 acres! While 2 vultures tore at his liver daily. The liver, being considered the seat of passion, regenerated each night so the torture never ceased. The Greeks, who already had a complicated relationship with their livers thanks to wine, must have found the symbolism delicious. These punishments weren't random, they were poetic. Each matched the crime, like moral puzzles turned into eternal torment. The Greeks believed the underworld wasn't just a dumping ground for souls, but a place where cosmic justice unfolded, exaggerated for effect. Think of it as morality theater with very committed actors. Yet here's the twist: these stories didn't necessarily frighten people into obedience. Instead, they became cautionary entertainment. Around hearths and symposiums, Greeks retold them with shudders and chuckles. Don't be like Tantalus, passing the wine jug and then refusing to share. Don't be like Ixion, hitting on your host's wife. The myths worked as both horror stories and social etiquette guides. The real terror wasn't just in the punishments, though. It was in the permanence. No appeal, no escape, no second chance. Sisyphus' rock, Tantalus a water, Ixion's wheel. They reminded mortals that death ended bargaining. You could outwit a tax collector, bribe a magistrate, or sweet-talk a neighbor. But you couldn't negotiate with eternity. And yet, the Greeks couldn't stop telling these stories with a glint of admiration. Who among us hasn't fantasized about finding a loophole, sneaking past the rules, or wriggling out of the inevitable? These figures became the myths we love most. Rebels who paid dearly, but at least tried. As pilgrims heard their names whispered in the dark halls of initiation, they must have felt a chill. To cheat death was tempting. To defy the gods thrilling, but to succeed, impossible. The underworld always collected its debt. Or did it? Because if you think the gallery of the damned is grim, just wait until we visit the shadowy borders, where mortals tried something even bolder. Calling back the dead itself, summoning shades from the earth, and demanding answers from beyond the grave. That was necromancy in Greece, and it made Sisyphus look like an amateur. Death was supposed to be the great silence. A soul went below, drank from leather, and disappeared into the grey shuffle of Hades. But the Greeks knew. Sometimes the dead didn't stay quiet. They lingered. They whispered. And on rare, unsettling occasions, they could be coaxed, or tricked, into speaking again. This practice had a name: necromancy. Literally, the calling up of corpses. Today it's the stuff of horror movies, but to the Greeks it was an uneasy mixture of religion, fear, and grim practicality. If you needed answers about the future, about vengeance, about guilt, you might just seek out the dead. But first, you had to reckon with ghosts. The Greek word was psyche, the fluttering soul, often imagined as a faint wisp or a miniature version of the person, pale and insubstantial. Ghosts weren't friendly. They were restless, needy, and often furious. They haunted crossroads, lingered around battlefields, and slipped into homes with the subtlety of smoke. You couldn't simply ignore them. This fear of the dead ran so deep that Greeks developed elaborate burial rituals to keep spirits satisfied. A coin was placed in the mouth or on the eyes to pay Charon, ferryman of the Styx. Libations of honey, milk, and wine were poured at graves to feed the departed. Neglect these duties, and the shade might return, not as Casper, but as something closer to a grumpy neighbor, banging on the ceiling at 3 a.m. Only now they could curse your crops or drive you mad. Ghosts weren't always vague terrors. Sometimes they had names. The restless shade of Patroclus begged Achilles for proper burial. Elpenor, Odysseus' fallen comrade, appeared in a dream demanding rites. Even heroes could return as wraiths, proving that fame didn't guarantee peace. So when someone wanted to speak to the dead deliberately, they weren't dabbling in parlor tricks. They were taking their life in their hands. The most famous necromantic site was the Necromancy of Acheron, a temple in Epirus perched near the rivers that supposedly led to the underworld. Pilgrims would descend into subterranean chambers, carved with labyrinthine tunnels. Priests instructed them in fasting, ritual baths, and sacrifices. Picture oil lamps flickering against damp stone, shadows stretching like grasping fingers, the air heavy with smoke and the tang of burnt entrails. If you weren't already terrified, the priests made sure you would be. Visitors were given beans, pork, and barley cakes, foods pleasing to the dead. Then came the chants, low and monotonous, designed to lull the living into a trance. Doors groaned on their hinges, hidden machinery rumbled, and then the dead appeared, or seemed to. Scholars debate whether the necromantean used theatrical trickery, puppetry, mirrors, or smoke to conjure illusions, or whether supplicants genuinely believed their ancestors had returned. But for those who stood there, trembling in the flicker of torchlight, it didn't matter. The answers felt real. The voices were enough. Even Odysseus himself, that connoisseur of trouble, sought necromancy. In Homer's Odyssey, he sacrificed black sheep on the shores of the underworld, their blood pouring into a pit. One by one, the dead gathered, hundreds of them, drawn to the offering. Odysseus had to brandish his sword to hold them back, letting only certain souls approach to speak. It was less a quiet say-ain'ts and more a chaotic press conference, with ghosts jostling for airtime. From this scene, the Greeks learned something chilling. The dead were desperate, hungry, eager for blood, and if you didn't handle them carefully, they'd overwhelm you. Necromancy wasn't about control, it was about negotiation. But here's the twist: Greeks feared ghosts deeply, yet they also used them. Soldiers cursed enemies by inscribing lead tablets and burying them in graves, calling upon the shades below to deliver vengeance. Lovers sought answers about fidelity. Farmers wanted omens for crops. It wasn't comfortable, but it was useful, like hiring a sketchy mechanic who also happened to be your only option. The fear never vanished, though. Imagine standing in the dark, chanting words you barely understood, knowing the boundary between worlds was thin, and then feeling a hand brush your shoulder. Was it a breeze? Or did something answer? That dread lingered. To the Greeks, the afterlife was never fully sealed away. The dead could leak back into the world of the living, and perhaps the living, foolishly, could reach into theirs. It was a risky trade. You might gain knowledge, but you might also come away haunted. And the dead, once disturbed, were not easy to put back to rest. It always began with silence. Not the ordinary hush of a temple, or the muffled quiet of night, but a silence so complete that it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. A pilgrim, trembling in the dark belly of the necromantean, would wait in that silence, oil lamp flickering in their hands, the flame bowing against the stagnant air. The priests had led them down twisting stairways, past iron doors that clanged shut with the finality of prison gates, and now they were here, somewhere between earth and the place beneath it. Imagine the feeling. The scent of smoke and singed flesh clinging to your nostrils, the taste of ash in your mouth, and the overwhelming pressure of stone all around you. You know you are underground, but you feel even lower than that, as if the ground itself has dropped you into its gut. You clutch the lamp harder, fingers sweaty, because if the flame goes out you will be left in blackness, so thick it will feel alive. The priests begin to chant. Their voices echo strangely, reverberating off walls you cannot see. It isn't music, exactly. more like the droning of bees, or the wind moaning through cracks in stone. The rhythm grows steady, hypnotic, and though you want to resist, your body begins to sway with it. And then the first sound comes. A scrape. Not close, but not far enough. You freeze, breath caught in your chest. Surely it is the priests. Surely it is part of the performance. But then you remember the stories. That this is how it happens. That the dead answer when called, dragging themselves through unseen passages. Your heart thuds against your ribs, and you remind yourself this is what you asked for. This is why you came. To ask a question no living man can answer. The priests lower their torches, plunging the chamber into half light. Their chants deepen, and then, impossibly, shapes emerge. Wisps at first, shifting like smoke, but they thicken, take form. Figures with hollow eyes and blurred faces shuffle at the edge of the fire's glow. Their mouths open, but no sound comes out. Only a hiss, like wind slipping through a broken reed. You want to run. Your knees know it. Your body knows it. But something stronger roots you there, the chance, the desperate need, to hear what they have to say. When Odysseus stood before the pit of blood, he felt this same press of spirits. They crowded him, clutching with hunger. To look into their faces was to see recognition. Faded, distorted, but there. Friends, comrades, family. What you feel in this temple is what he felt, that overwhelming surge of voices demanding attention, as if the whole underworld has been waiting for you specifically. The priest motions for silence. The shades lean forward, and then one speaks. The sound is strange, like a reed flute broken, its notes bending, warping. The words aren't clear, but the meaning lands anyway. They answer your question. They give what you came for. You should be relieved, but relief doesn't come. Instead, there's a coldness that seeps into your chest. Because if they can answer you now, it means they've been listening all along. Watching. Waiting. How many times did you walk past a grave, thinking it only a mound of stone, when beneath it eyes followed you? When you finally leave, stumbling back into daylight, blinking against the sun, something has changed. You have your answer, but you also have a new awareness, that the veil is thinner than you ever believed, that the dead are never far away. The Greeks carried this dread into their daily lives. They placed protective charms at doors, scratched curses onto lead tablets to bury in graves, and whispered prayers when passing tombs. They didn't merely believe in ghosts. They lived with the constant possibility of them. And in some ways, we still do. Every creak of a floorboard at midnight, every shadow in the corner of an empty room, it's the same unease. They gave it a name, built temples for it, and tried to control it. We invent horror movies and ghost tours. Different costumes, same fear. The legacy of Greek necromancy wasn't just religious. It shaped how Western culture thinks about ghosts, not as friendly companions, but as troubled, demanding echoes. Their fear bled forward into Roman ghost stories, into medieval tales of revenants, into our own fascination with haunted houses. Even today, when someone lights a candle in a cemetery or whispers to the dead, they echo rituals born on Greek soil, and the memory of what it felt like, the silence, the flicker, the breath of something unseen just beyond the torchlight, still haunts us. If you think whispering shades and hungry ghosts are unsettling, wait until you step into the shadowy realm of Greek curses, the kind inscribed on lead and buried with the dead, where anger and magic entwined in ways even the gods might flinch from. It always begins innocently enough. Someone wrongs you. A neighbor steals your goat. A rival wins the lover you wanted. A competitor bests you in the marketplace. And you seethe. Today we might mutter under our breath, maybe fire off a bitter text or a passive-aggressive Facebook post. But in ancient Greece, you went darker. You picked up a stylus, a strip of lead, and carved your anger straight into eternity. These were the katasmoi, cursed tablets. To the untrained eye, they were small, unassuming scraps of lead, often folded and nailed shut. But to the Greeks, they were lethal, loaded with words so heavy they could drag a man's fortune, health, or very soul down into the dust. Words weren't just sounds or scratches on a page, they were weapons. And when directed at the right ears, the gods below, the restless dead, they could devastate. Picture the act. A man crouches by lamplight, stylus in hand. His face is tight with resentment. The lead sheet lies before him like a blank canvas for his malice. Slowly, carefully, he writes, and so his tongue, his hands, his mind. May he stumble. May he fail. May he suffer. Each line curls with venom. Each stroke digs deeper into the metal, as though the anger itself carves the words. But writing alone wasn't enough. The curse had to be delivered. And this is where things turned theatrical. The tablet would be folded, pierced with nails or pins, an act not of decoration, but of binding. Nails meant power, control, a symbolic fastening of the victim's fate. Then, the little package of hatred would be dropped into a grave, well, or sanctuary. The dead, it was believed, acted as couriers. They carried the tablet's venom to the underworld gods, who would see it done. Imagine the unease of being in that graveyard at night, slipping the tablet into a tomb as quickly as possible, whispering the victim's name under your breath, then scurrying away before the shade noticed you. Because make no mistake, the dead didn't like to be disturbed. And asking them for favors was a dangerous business. The curses weren't always about enemies. Lovers used them too. Someone aching for affection might inscribe, "Let her burn for me, let her desire me alone, let her body refuse all others." It was both desperate and sinister, an attempt to invade another's heart by force. Even in love, the Greeks turned to the shadows, and this wasn't fringe practice. Cursed tablets have been found across the Greek world, from Athens to Sicily, from sanctuaries to sewers. They targeted politicians, athletes, shopkeepers, even entire teams before competitions. Words were aimed like daggers at reputations, livelihoods, and lives. You might walk past an enemy smiling, but secretly you were burying a piece of lead with their name etched into it. Now, imagine being the target. You wake up one morning, and everything feels off. Your business collapses, your horse throws you, your tongue falters during a speech. You wonder, is it coincidence? Or did someone send the underworld against you? The paranoia eats at you, because in a world where curses are real, failure isn't just bad luck, it's sabotage. The Greeks believed words had weight, a physical heft that clung to the soul. To speak was to act, and to write was to bind. Even the act of whispering a curse was dangerous. The wrong word, spoken in anger, could carry farther than you intended. So imagine the terror of words inscribed and delivered deliberately, words sharpened into blades and handed to the dead to wield. It wasn't just fear. It was belief in a system of cosmic justice, where words tipped the scales. If the gods above weren't listening, perhaps the gods below would. And the imagery, the folded tablets, the hammered nails, the whispered names, only added to the weight. The ritual itself must have felt intoxicating, a secret act of revenge hidden in the earth. But what lingers most is the realization that curses weren't anomalies. They were part of everyday life. Beneath the bustling agora, beneath the temples and theaters, beneath the very stones of the streets, hundreds of curses lay buried. They formed a hidden layer of Greek society, a parallel world of whispered hate and quiet desperation. And perhaps that's the most chilling part. It wasn't just the dead who haunted the living. It was the living who haunted each other, turning words into ghosts that clung and followed. If you thought curses scratched into lead were unsettling, wait until you step into the realm of ritual pollution, where death itself made a person untouchable, contagious, and in need of cleansing before the gods and mortals alike would let them back into the world. The Greeks believed death didn't just end a life, it leaked. Like a spilled jug of sour wine, death left a stain that spread, staining everything it touched. The word was miasma pollution, not dirt on the skin but a spiritual contagion that clung to people, homes, even entire cities. And it was terrifying, because miasma wasn't visible. You couldn't sweep it away or scrub it with soap. It was a shadow that attached itself to you, marking you as unclean in the eyes of both men and gods. To the Greeks, a corpse wasn't just a body, it was a danger zone. Touch it, walk too near. Even share a house with it, and you risked becoming toxic yourself. Imagine being in a Greek household when someone died. The air would thicken with grief, but also with fear. Women tore their hair, wailed, and beat their breasts as the body was washed, anointed, and wrapped. But every gesture was double-edged. On one hand, you had to honor the dead properly. On the other, you were now contaminated. The house itself was considered infected, a place the gods might turn their gaze away from unless purification was performed. That meant sacrifices, rituals, and cleansing baths. It meant fire carried through doorways to burn away the unseen stain. It meant no one in the household could attend festivals or set foot in temples until the pollution was cleansed. Your neighbor might cross the street to avoid you, not out of rudeness but out of self-preservation. Death was like radiation, unseen but lethal, seeping into everything. Murder made it worse. Killing wasn't just a crime against another human, but a rupture in cosmic order. A murderer radiated pollution like a furnace, corrupting not only themselves but anyone who harbored them. This is why Greek tragedy is soaked with the language of contagion. Think of Oedipus, unwittingly polluted by patricide and incest, bringing blight to Thebes until the truth was revealed. His body wasn't the only infected thing. His very presence sickened the land. The Greeks were practical people. They knew death was inevitable, but they wrapped it in ritual like a protective shield. Water drawn from a sacred spring might cleanse the pollution. Blood sacrifice might placate the gods. The simple act of stepping outside the city walls to bury a body was itself a form of purification, exiling the source of contagion away from the community. Now, let's pause for a moment and think about this in modern terms. Imagine going to a funeral today and being told, "Sorry, you're spiritually radioactive now. No Starbucks, no grocery shopping, no public outings until you've bathed in special water and slaughtered a goat." It sounds absurd, but for the Greeks it was law. Without ritual cleansing, you risk drawing divine punishment not just on yourself, but on everyone around you. And people believed it. When plague struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War, whispers spread that it wasn't merely bad luck or bad hygiene, but miasma unleashed by impiety and the unburied dead. Fear of contagion wasn't just medical, it was metaphysical. The truly unnerving part. Miasma clung even to the innocent. If you stumbled across a corpse on the roadside and tried to help, congratulations, you were polluted. If your husband died in your bed, you were polluted. If your city executed a criminal and you witnessed it, you were polluted. Pollution didn't care about intent. It didn't care about fairness. It followed you regardless. This made priests and priestesses especially cautious. They had to remain ritually pure to serve in temples. Some cults barred anyone who had recently attended a funeral. Others demanded lengthy purification rites. Certain gods, like Apollo, were particularly sensitive to miasma, and his shrines enforced strict boundaries. You might arrive at Delphi to seek the oracle, only to be turned away because your uncle had just died. This obsession with purity seeped into every corner of Greek life. Blood itself was suspicious, whether spilled in childbirth, murder, or sacrifice. Men returning from war needed cleansing. Women giving birth were both revered and shunned, considered liminal beings straddling life and death. It wasn't all doom, though. Rituals had a way of restoring balance. Washing in flowing water, fumigating with sulfur, or offering sacrifices could reset the cosmic scale. Communities could return to normal once the stain was lifted. But the fear never fully disappeared, because death never disappeared. It loomed, waiting for the next household to darken its door. Picture the whispers in a small Greek town. A man collapses in the marketplace and dies. Immediately, the stallholders back away, crossing themselves with gestures of warding. The body is carried out quickly, but the gossip spreads faster than the flies. Did you hear? His family is polluted now. For weeks, people avoid their house, not because of illness, but because of invisible taint. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. Imagine knowing your grief makes you untouchable. You've just buried your father, but now your neighbors won't share food with you. You've lost your child, but no one dares embrace you. Mourning was lonely in ways we might struggle to grasp today, and yet, there's a strange logic to it. Pollution wasn't just superstition. It was a way to manage the raw, unsettling power of death. It gave structure to grief, containment to chaos. By labeling death as dangerous, the Greeks created rituals to protect the living, to restore a sense of order when the natural order had been shattered. But there were cracks. Not everyone agreed on how miasma worked. Philosophers debated whether it was literal, like a contagion carried in the air, or symbolic, a moral stain visible only to the gods. Some scoffed at elaborate rituals. Others doubled down, inventing ever more intricate taboos. And in this confusion, fear flourished. Now imagine this fear weaponized. Accuse your rival of pollution, And suddenly they're not just disliked, they're untouchable. They can't enter temples, can't hold office, can't participate in civic life until they prove their purity. It's the ancient equivalent of social cancellation, only with divine thunderbolts on the line. The plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles are full of such accusations. Pollution wasn't just private grief, it was public drama. Whole cities trembled under its weight, convinced that one man's guilt could doom them all. And sometimes, the only way to cleanse the stain was exile, or death. This made pollution both a personal burden and a political tool. Leaders invoked it to justify trials, executions, and purges. Families whispered it to shame rivals. It hovered over every interaction with the dead, ensuring that even in mourning, fear was never far away. Yet amid the terror there was also intimacy. Families gathered around the dead not only to honor them, but to share the danger together. They bathed, they wailed, they bore the pollution as a collective. In that sense, miasma knit the living closer, even as it isolated them from the wider community. The smell of smoke after purification, the sting of sulfur in the nose, the chill of water pouring over hands still raw from digging a grave, these were the textures of cleansing, reminders that grief required not just tears, but ritual labor. To be human was to be contaminated, and to live was to find ways of washing it off. And still, the fear lingered. Even when purified, even when restored, Greeks knew death had brushed them. And once touched, you could never be entirely the same. If you think the fear of miasma was heavy, wait until you descend deeper into the shadows, where restless corpses refused to stay put, and the Greeks whispered of the terrifying revenants, the walking dead who clawed their way back into the world of the living. The Greeks could accept that the dead had their place. The underworld was vast, grey, and dreary, but it was orderly. The living stayed above, the dead stayed below, and the two worlds only touched when rituals demanded it. But what happens when the dead don't play along? When they claw their way back to the surface, dragging their unrest into the world of sunlight? That's when you got the stories of revenants. The restless corpses that refused to lie still. Unlike the wispy shades drifting in Homer's underworld, revenants were physical. They weren't content with whispers or dreams. They wanted flesh presence, and sometimes vengeance. To the Greeks, the most terrifying possibility wasn't ghosts. It was bodies that got back up. The fear of revenants grew from a simple truth: improper burial was dangerous. Without the rites, the washing, the offerings, the coins for charon, a soul was stuck. And a stuck soul was a restless one. People who died violently, especially murder victims, were prime candidates for returning. Their anger anchored them to the living, driving them to walk among the breathing until justice, or revenge, was done. Imagine being in a small Greek town after a suspicious death. The whispers would begin almost immediately. His shade won't rest. He'll come back. Families hurried to bury the body correctly, loading it with offerings and prayers. But even then, suspicion lingered. At night, when dogs barked at nothing and shutters rattled in the wind, people muttered the name of the dead, certain he was pacing the streets. The Greeks had preventative measures, of course. Some bodies were pinned down with heavy stones or nails to keep them in the grave. Others were buried outside the city limits, far from the houses of the living. In some cases, heads were severed and placed elsewhere, grisly insurance that the dead wouldn't find their way back whole. It sounds brutal, but when the alternative is your dead neighbor banging on your door at midnight, a few nails seemed reasonable. The revenants weren't always violent, but they were always unsettling. They hovered at thresholds, watched silently from shadows, and slipped into dreams. One tale tells of restless soldiers haunting battlefields, their armored forms visible in the moonlight, still marching long after their bodies rotted. Another spoke of murdered women who returned to curse their killers, their voices carrying on the wind like bitter songs. There's a practical side here, too. Revenants explained the inexplicable. A sudden illness, a run of bad luck, a child's night terrors. These could all be blamed on the dead refusing to rest. It was easier to believe in a vengeful corpse than to accept chaos. But beneath the superstition lay something deeper: guilt. To the Greeks, revenants weren't random, they were justice embodied. If you had wronged someone, you expected them back. A cheated neighbor, a betrayed friend, a murdered rival. The living knew they might one day hear a knock at the door and find the past staring back with hollow eyes. This fear gave birth to rituals of protection. Garlic hung at doorways, libations poured at crossroads, and charms placed under pillows. Families told stories not just to frighten children, but to remind them respect the dead, honor them, keep them at peace. Because the alternative was too frightening to imagine. And here's where the Greeks feel startlingly modern. Our own horror stories are crowded with revenants, zombies, vampires, the walking dead. But the Greeks got there first. They didn't need rotting corpses to shamble through fields. They only needed the memory of someone wronged, someone silenced too soon. That was horror enough. Picture yourself walking home one night in Athens, the moon high, the streets quiet. A shadow flickers just at the edge of vision, following too closely. You quicken your pace. The sound of sandals on stone echoes behind you. You turn, but there's nothing there, only the faint smell of earth, as though the grave itself has risen to walk the street. And you remember the funeral a week ago. The whispered rumors that the rites weren't done properly. The victim's mother keening, he will not rest. And suddenly, every step home feels borrowed. This was how revenants lived in Greek imagination. Not just in stories, but in the twitch of fear at a sound in the dark. The weight of silence pressing too heavily at night. They were reminders that death wasn't tidy, that the boundary between living and dead was porous, and that injustice had a way of walking back into the world, no matter how deep you buried it. If you thought restless corpses were chilling, wait until you hear how even the gods weren't immune to death's taint. How divine figures themselves could be entangled in the same pollution, curses, and shadows that haunted mortals. It's easy to think of the Greek gods as untouchable, shining figures on Olympus, immune to the grime and grief of mortal life. But death had a way of seeping even into divine veins. The Greeks didn't just imagine mortals haunted by shades. They told stories of gods themselves, brushing too close to mortality, tainted by death's pollution, trapped in rituals they were supposed to rise above. Take Apollo, the radiant god of prophecy and music, who once found himself drenched not in sunlight, but in guilt. He killed the Cyclopes, the very smiths who forged Zeus's thunderbolts, in a fit of vengeance. That single act wasn't brushed off as god stuff. No, Apollo had to wander the world, ritually purified like a common criminal, serving time as if the divine and mortal courts were one. The message was clear. Even gods could become unclean when blood spilled wrongly. Blood pollution, miasma, wasn't just dirt you could wash away. It was spiritual contagion, something that clung to skin, soul, and reputation. The Greeks feared it because it spread. If you touched a murderer, ate at their table, or walked on the same ground, the stain could leach into you. Imagine gossip, but supernatural and sticky. Once you were marked, no handshake. No polite smile could save you. You carried the scent of corruption, visible to the gods, and often to the unlucky mortals around you. Now picture the awkward scene of a god at a purification ritual. Apollo, radiant hair shining, forced to submit as a mortal priest sprinkles him with pig's blood and water, mumbling words meant to cleanse. The same god who commanded oracles had to stand still like a guilty schoolboy, enduring ritual humiliation because divine radiance couldn't burn off murder. That's the Greek imagination at work. No one, not even the divine, floated above the rules. And it wasn't just Apollo. Dionysus, that unpredictable god of wine and ecstasy, carried his own shadows. His myth begins with death. His mother, Semele, incinerated by Zeus's lightning. Born from tragedy, Dionysus wandered the earth with madness always at his heels. His followers, the Maenads, tore animals limb from limb in ecstatic frenzy, blood painting the forests. Scholars like to say this was symbolic. The Greeks closer to the action thought it was pollution in its purest form. Divine joy always came laced with rot. But the most chilling examples weren't the dramatic myths. They were the quiet rituals where gods had to be shielded from the stench of death. Temples barred the door to anyone tainted by recent funerals or childbirth. Priests paused ceremonies if they smelled corruption near the altar. Imagine the awkward shuffle you approach the sanctuary. The priest squints at you and says, "Didn't your cousin die last week?" Out. You're polluted. The gods demanded purity, not because they were delicate, but because even divine presence couldn't stand beside the contagion of death. And yet, the stories remind us that gods weren't untouched. They too had brushes with mortality. Persephone, goddess of spring, spent half a year in the underworld, tasting the pomegranate seeds of death itself. Hades bound her there, but her presence blurred the line between divine life and shadowy death. Every spring she returned, but always with a trace of the underworld clinging to her like dust on her sandals. The Greeks loved this paradox. Their gods were mighty, but not stainless. They weren't perfect ideals, they were magnified humans, glorious yet vulnerable to the same stains, curses and griefs. When a god fell into miasma, it wasn't just a myth. It was a reminder that death's pollution was universal. No matter your power, death dirtied everything it touched. Now, if this all sounds distant, think about modern scandals. Politicians resigning after public disgrace, celebrities issuing tearful apologies, CEOs stepping down to take responsibility. That's our version of divine miasma. The stain isn't physical. It's reputational, contagious, and the only cure is ritual humiliation, apology tours, and sometimes exile from the public stage. The Greeks would nod knowingly. They'd say, yes, pollution spreads. Even the powerful can't escape. It's almost comforting in a dark way. The Greeks saw justice as impartial, woven into the fabric of existence. A god might strike you with lightning, but if they themselves spilled the wrong blood, they too had to bow their head and seek cleansing. In a world where kings and rulers often seemed untouchable, the myths whispered otherwise. No one was too high to fall. Imagine being an ordinary Athenian hearing these stories by firelight. You glance at the shrine across the street, at the offerings stacked beneath Apollo's statue, and suddenly you wonder, if even Apollo had to undergo purification, what chance do you have? The myth doesn't just entertain, it disciplines. It says live carefully, honor the rites, respect the gods, because pollution is everywhere, waiting, sticky as ash on skin. And yet, for all their seriousness, the Greeks added a touch of humor in how they framed divine slips. They didn't hide the gods' failings. They dramatized them, whispered them, laughed about them in symposia. Because if the gods themselves could stumble into death's grime, then perhaps human blunders weren't so shameful after all. But the laughter always had an edge, for if gods could falter, they could also punish with terrifying precision. And the Greeks would remind you, if you thought pollution among the Olympians was scandalous, just wait until you heard how ordinary mortals turned that fear into obsession, weaving curses, rituals, and desperate bargains to control a world where death never stayed politely out of sight. Death, in the Greek imagination, was stubborn. It didn't care if you were a farmer, a queen, or the son of Zeus himself. Once your shade drifted to Hades, that was it. But that didn't stop mortals, and sometimes even gods, from trying to slip past the bouncer at the gates of the underworld. And oh, the bargains they made. Let's start with Sisyphus, the man whose name sounds like a sneeze, and whose punishment became the most famous treadmill in history. He tricked Thanatos, the personification of death itself, by tying him up with chains. For a glorious moment, no one on earth could die. Imagine ancient warriors stabbing each other on the battlefield, pausing in confusion as their wounds refused to finish the job. Plagues spread, but no funerals followed. It was chaos, but also proof that one crafty mortal could throw a wrench into cosmic machinery. Of course, Zeus wasn't amused. Once death was released, Sisyphus was hauled below, sentenced to roll his eternal boulder. The Greeks got the message: cheat death, and death cheats you harder. But Sisyphus wasn't alone. Orpheus, the rock star of antiquity, tried his own bargain. Armed with a lyre and a voice that could melt even stone, hearted Hades. He descended into the shadows to retrieve his beloved Eurydice. And it worked, almost. His music softened Persephone's heart, stirred the shades to tears, and even made the Furies dab at their eyes. Hades, notoriously stingy, relented, with one cruel condition: don't look back until you reach the surface. Simple, right? Except it wasn't. Orpheus turned too soon, Eurydice dissolved into smoke, and every Greek storyteller nodded sagely. The lesson wasn't subtle. Mortals can beg, bribe, or sing, but death always has the last laugh. Then there was Alcestis, wife of Admetus, who pulled off a bargain no spouse today would agree to. When Admetus's time came, the gods allowed a loophole: someone else could die in his place. His parents said no. His friends found excuses. But Alcestis stepped forward, sacrificing her life for her husband. Down she went, until Heracles, drunk and sentimental, barged into Hades, wrestled death like it was a tavern brawl, and dragged her back. The myth became a touchstone for Greek ideas of love, loyalty, and the occasional utility of having a god-drinking buddy. It wasn't always so dramatic. Ordinary Greeks looked for smaller cheats, protective charms, whispered spells, ritual offerings slipped to chthonic deities. A coin placed on a corpse's tongue to bribe Charon, the ferryman. Honey cakes left for Cerberus, to keep his 3 mouths busy. These weren't grand schemes but desperate insurance policies, little hacks against the system. Because everyone knew, the underworld was a bureaucracy, and sometimes you had to grease the right palms, or paws. And if none of that worked, well, there was always the hope of memory, to be remembered, sung about, carved in stone. This was the Greeks' truce cheat. Your body might rot, your shade might wander, but your Cleos, your glory, could outlast death itself. Achilles knew it, Homer sang it, and countless nameless Athenians hoped that at least their children would speak their names at the family tomb. Now, you might think all this sounds exhausting, like filing taxes, but with more blood sacrifices. And you'd be right. The Greeks never imagined a gentle afterlife. They pictured a relentless struggle, where even in death you might haggle, scheme, or wrestle your way toward a better fate. And maybe that's why their stories still grip us. Because deep down, who hasn't wanted to bargain with the inevitable? Who hasn't thought, maybe if I'm clever enough, charming enough, or stubborn enough, I can stretch the rules? The Greeks knew it was foolish, but they also knew it was human. So the next time you hear about a deal with the devil, or watch a movie where someone bargains for more time, remember, it's the same tune Orpheus played, the same gamble Sisyphus rolled, the same bargain Alcestis struck. Death waits, patient and unblinking. And every culture, from the marble streets of Athens to our glowing screens, tells the same story. We can cheat for a while, but in the end, the house always wins.